Alara arrived in the valley with the last of the autumn rains, a woman who seemed to have been carved from the same gray stone as the mountains that hemmed them all in. She was a widow, though no one knew it then. They only saw the quiet exhaustion in her posture, and the way her gaze seemed to be fixed on something 1,000 miles beyond the tree line. She had come to a place that specialized in endings. The valley was a final stop for those who had run out of road, a cold, hard pocket of the world, where the wind spoke the only consistent language, and the earth made few promises. She had next to nothing, just a small, tightly clutched inheritance that felt more like an anchor than a lifeline. It was enough to buy the one piece of property that even the most desperate had long since abandoned: the old Miller cabin. Silas Croft, who owned the general store and a controlling interest in nearly everything else that drew breath in the valley, finalized the sale with a look that was equal parts pity and predatory satisfaction. He was a man built of conventional wisdom, his certainty as solid and unyielding as the frozen winter ground. He sold her the deed for a sum that was insulting in its smallness, a tacit acknowledgement that he was selling her a liability, not an asset. The Miller place wasn't just dilapidated, it was cursed by its own geography. It sat on a low, marshy patch of land where a sullen spring wept from the earth year-round, turning the soil into a cold, greedy mud that swallowed fence posts and rotted foundations. The cabin itself is mostly draft, Silas had warned her, his voice a low rumble of paternalistic concern. He leaned over the worn counter of his store, the air thick with the scent of dried goods and coming snow. The floorboards have the rot, and that spring, it's a nuisance. Never freezes, never stops running. Makes the whole plot a mire. You'll spend all your time fighting the damp. He advised her as he advised everyone. Cut and stack 3 times the firewood you think you'll need. Chink the logs with moss and mud before the first hard frost. And pray the winter is a mild one. It never was. Alara simply nodded, her face betraying nothing. She took the iron key from his hand, its cold weight a confirmation of her new reality. The community watched her go, a silent chorus of doubt. They saw a lone woman, too thin for the coming cold, buying a ruin. They saw folly. They saw a tragedy unfolding in slow motion, another soul to be broken by the valley's unforgiving calculus. Whispers followed her like her own shadow, christening her with the soft cruelty of rural gossip. The fool, the madwoman, a ghost before she had even died. The cabin was worse than Silas had described. It was a skeleton picked clean by years of neglect. The wind moved through the gaps in the chinking, with a low, mournful whistle, a constant lament. The floorboards sagged and groaned under her slight weight, soft in places with a damp, spongy decay. And outside, the spring was a constant gurgling presence. It emerged from a fissure in a cluster of granite boulders, not 50 yards from the cabin, pooling in a shallow basin of black stones, before seeping out to saturate the ground around her new home. The water was crystalline and achingly cold to the touch. It was the source of the rot, the damp, the misery that had driven away all previous occupants. It was, by all accounts, the property's fatal flaw. For the first week, Alara did as was expected. She worked from dawn until the light failed, her movements methodical and spare. She gathered fallen branches, patched the worst of the holes in the roof with salvaged tin and tar, and began the back-breaking work of clearing the cabin's interior of the debris left by animals in time. She was a solitary figure against the vast, indifferent landscape, her smallness emphasized by the towering peaks and the enormous, bruised-looking sky. Ben, a young trapper who kept to himself, would sometimes see her from his lines on the ridge. He watched her work, a steady, uncomplaining rhythm of labor, and felt a strange pang of respect mixed with the same pity everyone else felt. He saw a woman trying to hold back the tide with a teacup. The confrontation with Silas happened, as she knew it would, When her work began to deviate from the script of survival, the valley understood. It was during the second week, when the nights began to carry a new and sharper bite, that Alara had her moment of insight. She had woken before dawn, the air in the cabin a physical weight of cold that stole her breath. Outside, a hard frost had silvered every surface, turning the world into a brittle masterpiece of white and gray. But as she approached the spring to fetch water, she saw it. A faint, ghostly plume of vapor was rising from the water's surface, a spectral breath in the frozen air. The ground immediately around the spring's edge was dark and damp, untouched by the frost that coated everything else. A small, stubborn patch of green moss thrived there, an impossible jewel of life in a world of white. She knelt, ignoring the cold mud that seeped into the knees of her trousers. She plunged her hand into the water. It was not warm, not in the way a fire is warm. It was cold. But it was a consistent, liquid cold, a temperature that was, by comparison to the sub-zero air, a form of profound and stable heat. The air was freezing, the ground was frozen, the trees were frozen, but this water, bubbling ceaselessly from the deep earth, was not. It was life. It was energy. A memory surfaced, a fragment from a lecture her father, a geologist, had given her long ago. He spoke of the Earth's constant temperature, the geothermal gradient, how just a few feet below the surface, the world forgot the seasons, remaining a steady, reliable temperature year-round. The spring was a direct line to that quiet, subterranean constancy. The idea that formed in her mind was so radical, so contrary to every piece of advice she had been given, that it felt like a form of madness. They told her to fight the cold with fire, to build a fortress against the winter. Her plan was to invite the Earth's own quiet coolness inside, to use the very thing they called a curse as her salvation. She would not fight the cold. She would moderate it. She would dig. She would lay a network of channels beneath the cabin floor, a circulatory system, and divert the spring water through it. The constant flow of 40-degree water, she reasoned, wouldn't make the cabin hot, but it would prevent it from ever truly freezing. It would create a stable environment, a bulwark of temperate coolness against the lethal, biting frost. It was an idea born of desperation and scientific poetry. Her work began that day. She abandoned the woodpile and picked up a shovel. The ground resisted, a stubborn mix of rock and clay and sucking mud. The labor was agonizing. Each shovelful was a dead weight that strained the muscles in her back and arms. But she worked with a feverish intensity, a woman possessed by a vision no one else could see. She started digging a long, deep trench from the spring's overflow pool, aiming it toward the cabin's foundation. This was the main artery. It was this trench that brought Silas down from his store. He stood on the edge of her property, his arms crossed over his barreled chest, his face a mask of disbelief. "Woman," he called out, his voice carrying easily in the thin air, "what in the name of all that's holy are you doing?" Alara paused, leaning on her shovel. She was splattered with mud, her face pale with exhaustion. "I'm digging a ditch," she said, her voice flat. "I can see that," he retorted, stepping closer, his boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. "It looks like you're trying to channel that blasted spring right under your house. Are you trying to flood yourself out before the snow even falls? Have you lost your senses entirely?" "The water needs to go somewhere," she replied, offering no further explanation. She would not try to articulate the delicate physics of her plan to this man. It would be like trying to describe color to someone born blind. To him, water was wet and cold, and the only answer to cold was fire. His skepticism curdled into anger. The spring originated on land that bordered his own, its source somewhere up the hill on his property before it emerged on hers. "You're meddling with things you don't understand," he warned, his voice low and threatening. "That spring is a delicate balance. You start digging channels, you could change the flow, dry it up, or worse, Turn this whole side of the valley into a swamp. Leave it be. Get back to chopping wood like a sensible person." She just looked at him, her silence a more potent refusal than any argument. She turned and drove the shovel back into the earth. The sound of the metal scraping against stone was her only answer. Silas watched her for another minute, then turned on his heel and stomped away, muttering about madwomen and Eastern foolishness. The story of Alara digging her own moat spread through the valley before nightfall, cementing her status as the resident lunatic. The real challenge came at night. To get enough water pressure to feed the system she envisioned, she needed to slightly raise the level of the spring's main pool. The most effective way to do this was to partially block the main fissure where the water emerged from the granite boulders. Boulders that sat squarely on the property line between her land and Silas's. During the day, she left it alone. But each evening, as twilight bled across the sky, she would engage in a private, Herculean ritual. There was a large, flat-bottomed slab of granite, nearly as big as a tabletop, lying near the fissure. It took all of her strength, using a long, sturdy log as a lever, to pivot and slide this stone over the mouth of the spring. It didn't stop the flow, but it constricted it, forcing the water level in the pool to rise a few precious inches, and directing a stronger current into the mouth of her new trench. It was a temporary dam, a nightly intervention. And every morning, before the first light, she would return and lever the great stone back, restoring the natural flow before anyone, especially Silas, could see what she had done. This nightly act of labor became the subject of new rumor. Ben, checking his traps at dusk one evening, saw her silhouette straining against the lever, a small, determined figure moving a seemingly impossible weight. He told a friend at the store, and the story became distorted. She was practicing some kind of dark magic, wrestling with the stones. She was trying to steal Silas's water. The phrase, repeated with a shake of the head, was that she rolls a giant stone over his doorway each night. The spring was seen as the doorway to his land's vitality, and her actions were a strange nightly violation. Inside the cabin, her project was even more frantic. With the help of the same lever system, she pried up the rotting floorboards, exposing the damp, cold earth beneath. The smell of decay and wet soil filled the small space. In this cramped, dark environment, she began to excavate the intricate looping network of shallow trenches that would form her heat exchanger. It was brutal, claustrophobic work. She filled buckets with the heavy, wet earth and hauled them outside, one by one, until a small mountain of dark soil grew beside her cabin. She lined the trenches with a thick layer of clay she found by the creek bed, painstakingly packing it into a smooth, waterproof channel. Ben was the only one who offered any help. He appeared one afternoon as she was struggling to move a section of a fallen tree she hoped to split and use as a crude, hollowed-out pipe. He didn't ask what it was for. He simply took one end of the log. "You'll break your back," he said, his voice quiet. Together they moved it into place. He watched her work for a while, his brow furrowed in confusion. He saw the network of clay-lined ditches under her floor. It looked like the digging of a mad creature, a mole or a badger. "The winter's coming on fast," he said, stating the obvious. "The ground will freeze solid soon. You won't be able to dig." "I know," she said, not looking up from her work. "I'm almost finished." He shook his head and left her a small bundle of smoked fish and a block of hard cheese on her doorstep. It was a gesture of kindness, but also of pity. He was leaving provisions for the condemned. By the time the first snows came, dusting the peaks in a fine white powder, her system was complete. A main channel led from the spring pool to the cabin's foundation. There, it split, feeding the labyrinth of clay pipes she had laid beneath where the floor would be. The trenches wound back and forth, covering the entire area of the small cabin, before converging into a single outflow pipe that drained into the marshy ground far behind the house. She replaced the floorboards, leaving a small trapdoor so she could monitor the flow. Then, for the first time, she rolled the great stone into place at dusk, and did not roll it back. She opened the intake valve, a simple wooden gate she had constructed. She sat in the dark cabin and listened. At first there was nothing. Then she heard it. A faint, liquid gurgling sound from beneath her feet. It was the sound of the earth's blood circulating beneath her home. There was no dramatic rush of heat. The air in the cabin remained cold. She felt a sharp, sickening pang of doubt. Had it all been for nothing? Had she wasted her last reserves of strength and time on a mad fantasy? She fell into an exhausted sleep, huddled in every blanket she owned. When she woke, something was different. The air was still cold, but the brutal biting edge was gone. The intense, painful chill that radiated from the floor was absent. She swung her legs out of her cot and placed her bare feet on the wooden planks. They were cool, but not the ice-cold they had been for weeks. A profound, bone-deep ache she hadn't even realized she was carrying had begun to ease. She went to the window and scraped away the thin layer of frost. Outside, the world was white. The first real snow of the season had fallen, a thick, silent blanket. Her woodpile was pitifully small, but for the first time she felt a flicker of hope. The valley settled into the rhythm of winter. The days grew short and the nights descended with a profound, star-dusted cold. The talk in Silas's store was of the weather, of firewood consumption, of whose roof was leaking. Alara's name was mentioned less frequently. She was a lost cause, a ghost in her own home, presumably freezing to death in her self-dug swamp. They were just waiting for the day when the smoke from her chimney ceased for good. But the smoke rarely rose from her chimney at all. She used her small stove only for cooking, burning a few sticks of wood a day. This fact, observed by Ben from his ridge, was the most perplexing detail of all. How could she be alive in that ruin with no fire? He imagined her huddled in a state of near hibernation, slowly succumbing to the cold. Then came the great freeze. It was not a storm, but a quiet, lethal invasion of Arctic air that descended from the north and gripped the valley for 2 solid weeks. The sky was a hard, brilliant blue by day, and a black, glittering void by night. The temperature dropped to 20, then 30, then 40 degrees below zero. The cold was a physical entity, a predator. It found every crack, every weakness. The snow squeaked underfoot with a sound like tearing silk. Trees exploded in the forest, their sap freezing and splitting the trunks with a sound like a rifle shot. In the valley, it was a state of siege. The community huddled indoors, feeding their stoves relentlessly. The immense wood piles they had been so proud of in the autumn began to shrink at an alarming rate. Pipes froze and burst. Livestock, even in their barns, were dying. Silas's store became the grim hub of information. People came in, their faces swathed in wool, their breath crystallizing instantly, to report on their dwindling supplies. Silas himself was worried. His own house, the best built in the valley, was struggling. The cold was relentless, sucking the heat out through the thick log walls. He was burning through a cord of wood every 3 days. His youngest child developed a racking cough, and the doctor, snowed in miles away, was unreachable. During the worst of it, Ben, driven by a gnawing worry, decided to check on Alara. The journey from his own small cabin was a brutal ordeal. The cold was so intense it felt like a physical blow, stealing his breath and burning his exposed skin. He expected to find the Miller cabin silent and dead. He expected to have to break down the door and find her frozen in her bed. As he approached, he saw no smoke from the chimney, and his heart sank. This was it. The tragedy had run its course. He pounded on the door, his gloved fist making a dull thud. "Alara, are you in there?" he shouted, his voice thin in the vast, frozen silence. He was already planning how he would force the door, what he would do with the body. The door creaked open. Alara stood there, wearing a simple wool sweater. She was not bundled in furs and blankets. Her face was pale, but she was alive and alert. And from the cabin behind her, a wave of air washed over him. It was not hot. It was not the dry, scorching heat of a wood stove. It was a cool, slightly damp, but distinctly not frozen air. It was the air of a cellar in autumn, not a cabin in the heart of a historic freeze. He stared at her, speechless. He stepped inside. The difference was staggering. Outside, the world was a lethal crystalline hell. Inside, it was a sanctuary of stability. The air was breathable. The floor did not radiate a soul-stealing cold. A single candle flickered on the table, and a small pot of something simmered on the tiny stove, giving off a faint, pleasant aroma. For the first time, Ben looked at her not with pity, but with a profound and unsettling awe. "How?" he finally managed to whisper, his own breath still pluming in the cabin's cool air. She simply smiled, a small, tired curving of her lips. "The spring," she said. "It doesn't freeze." The climax came 2 nights later, at the very nadir of the cold. The temperature had bottomed out at a terrifying 45 below. In Silas's house, the situation was dire. Their wood was almost gone, reduced to a few precious logs they were feeding into the stove one by one. His daughter's cough had worsened, her breathing shallow and ragged. The house was dangerously cold, the interior walls coated in a layer of frost. Desperation, cold and sharp as an icicle, finally broke through Silas's pride. He had to get help. He had to get his daughter to a warmer place. But there was nowhere to go. Every house was in the same predicament. And then he remembered. He remembered the madwoman and her ditch. He remembered Ben's strange, stammering story at the store the day before. A story no one had believed, about the impossible warmth in the Miller cabin. It was insane. It was impossible. But it was the only option he had left. Bundling his sick child in every blanket they had, he carried her in his arms and staggered out into the merciless night. His wife followed, her face a mask of fear. The walk to Alara's cabin was a journey through a landscape from a nightmare. The cold was a living thing, trying to force its way into his lungs, to freeze the moisture in his eyes. When he finally reached the dark, silent structure, he hammered on the door with a wild, desperate energy, half convinced he was a fool, that he had brought his family here to die on a madwoman's doorstep. The door opened, just as it had for Ben. Alara stood there, her calm face illuminated by the candle she held. Silas was hit by the same wave of impossibly temperate air. It was a physical shock. He stumbled inside, his daughter a leaden weight in his arms. He looked around the small, spare cabin. He saw the bare floorboards, the simple furniture. He saw no massive fire, no evidence of the frantic battle against the cold that was consuming every other soul in the valley. There was only a profound, inexplicable, life-saving lack of cold. He looked at Alara, his face a ruin of pride, fear, and utter confusion. His gaze fell to the floor, as if he could see through the wood to the secret beneath. "How?" he croaked, the word a ragged puff of white vapor. His wife was already unwrapping their child, her hands shaking with relief as she felt the cabin's steady, gentle air on her daughter's feverish skin. Alara did not gloat. She did not remind him of his mockery or his warnings. She simply took the child from his arms. "I'll put some broth on," she said, her voice quiet and steady. "The cabin is still burning." Silas didn't understand the phrase. He looked at the tiny, cold stove, then back at her. Burning with what? But as he sat there, the lethal chill slowly seeping out of his bones, he began to grasp a truth his rigid, practical mind had never been able to conceive. The cabin was burning with the constant, inexhaustible fire of the deep earth, a warmth that did not consume, but merely endured. He had spent his life fighting the winter, while this woman had simply made peace with it. The deal was done. He was wrong. She was right. When the great freeze finally broke, the valley was a changed place. The stories that emerged were harrowing, tales of loss, of close calls, of desperate survival. But the most powerful story of all was the one that came from the old Miller place. The story of how Silas Croft and his family had survived the worst night of the freeze in the cabin of the madwoman, a cabin that was warm without a fire. The mockery and suspicion that had surrounded Ilara evaporated like frost in the morning sun. It was replaced by a quiet, profound respect that bordered on reverence. They no longer called her the fool or the madwoman. They began to call her Ilara of the Spring, or simply the founder. Silas, humbled and forever in her debt, was the first to come to her, not with warnings, but with a request. He asked her to teach him. He wanted to understand the principles, to build a system for his own home. He offered to pay, to provide men and materials, anything she asked. She taught him, and after him, she taught others. The men who had laughed at her digging now came to her for instruction, their faces earnest and their questions respectful. They learned to see the land not as an adversary, but as a complex system of hidden energies. They learned that the weeping spring, once a curse, was the valley's greatest gift. Over the next few years, a network of trenches and clay pipes spread beneath the floors of the valley's cabins, a subterranean web of shared knowledge, a testament to an idea that had once been dismissed as madness. Ilara's folly became the valley method. The community, once so vulnerable to the whims of winter, became resilient. They still cut wood for cooking and for the pleasure of a crackling hearth. But the desperate life-or-death battle against the cold was over. They had learned to live with the winter, not just survive it. Years later, a traveler passing through the valley might have remarked on its unusual prosperity, on the sturdiness of its homes and the quiet confidence of its people. If they stayed for a winter, they would have been amazed by the subtle, constant comfort of the cabins, a warmth that seemed to rise from the very earth itself. And if they asked, they would be told the story of the woman who arrived with nothing, who bought the worthless land, and who listened to the whisper of the water while everyone else was deafened by the shouting of the wind. The narrator of such a story would conclude that true ingenuity is not always about grand invention. Sometimes it is about the courage to look at what has been discarded and see its hidden potential. It is about the quiet, stubborn refusal to accept the world only as it appears on the surface. Ilara had arrived in the valley seeking an end, a final, quiet place to grieve. Instead, she had found a beginning. She had taught an entire community that the most powerful solutions are often not built to rage against the world, but to move in harmony with its deepest, most enduring currents. She had shown them that survival, and indeed life itself, was not about the fire you could build, but about the warmth you could find.